Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Seddiq, and I'm a tech policy reporter for Bloomberg Government. And today we're going to talk about free speech and content moderation. Before we get started, I'm going to have these wonderful panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right in. Joel.
Joel Thayer, president of the Digital Progress Institute.
Hi, I'm Yael Eisenstat. I am the Director of Policy and Impact at Cybersecurity for Democracy, and I'm based out of NYU.
Mchangama. I run the Future of Free Speech. We're an independent think tank located at Vanderbilt University in Nashville.
And I am Ari Cohn. I am lead counsel for tech policy at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression.
Okay, thank you. So I want to start by a little bit of setting the scene. This morning, Vice President J.D. Vance had this speech around AI at the Paris Summit. A lot of what he was pushing had to do with free speech, framing the lens of AI development through promoting free speech. And we've seen this rhetoric coming from the Trump administration. I mean, on day one, President Trump signed an executive order pledging to, quote, restore free speech and end federal censorship. I want you guys to contextualize this for us. What does it mean when we say free speech online today?
Any takers?
Yeah,
Well,
Sure.
Joel?
Well, obviously, when it comes to the digital age, there's a lot. There's myriad definitions as to what free speech means. First, what are we talking about? Who is the person actually making the speech? I think that's something that even courts are grappling with right now, right? I mean, you have a lot of these different varying opinions on whose speech trumps who. What does corporate speech look like in today's digital age? Who's pulling the levers? There's obviously antitrust implications when it comes to speech. I mean, you have major companies that have a significant amount of market share, being able to decide, who gets to say and do what at any which time. So it's a very amorphous concept, and to be frank, I didn't catch the Vice President's comments today, but I would imagine it's in that line of evaluating where the power dynamics are with respect to speech, and certainly who is pulling what lever. And I also think that there is an aversion, especially in this administration, for even government bodies for pulling those levers as well. I mean, you saw that play out in the Supreme Court. And so I think it's a hodgepodge of different considerations and concerns, but I think it really comes down to the power dynamics and who is controlling which platform, and also who's the person behind the curtain. Sorry, I just saw Wicked, so you might get a few different Wizard of Oz references.
Can I pick up on that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so picking up on Joel said, part of how I look at what speech is online is trying very hard to differentiate between what is speech, what is something that somebody said or published online, and what the companies do with that speech. And I think it is a really important differentiator. There will always be debates about what the limits of speech online should be, and we could debate that till we turn blue in the face. Part of what's important about the power dynamics of who controls a platform or who controls how speech is, whether it's moderated or amplified or recommended. What we really need to start to be able to differentiate in these conversations, again, is anything that somebody says online, and even if it is something awful that we do not like, as long as it is not actually breaking the law, inciting to violence, that is what free speech is about. But what a company decides to do with that speech, whether it is suppressing viewpoints, whether it is overly amplifying certain things, whether it is targeting and micro-targeting people based on certain characteristics, those are the things that I think we need to talk about more, as opposed to it focusing so much on pretending that it's all about whether something is fact-checked or whether it's something we dislike. I want to focus on the company's own tools and what they do with the speech.
And can I add one extra thing to that? I mean, you bring up a very good point on the distinction between the concept of free speech in and of itself, and then also the baked-in constitutional concerns with respect to the First Amendment. Although they are constantly spoken about in tandem, they are two very different issues. One has to do with the government's ability to silence one side versus the other side, or amplify one side or the other side. The other is just the general concept of what you can say in a free society. So I think it's a very good framing.
You know what? I'm piggyback on that too, because I actually, Yael might be surprised. I agree with both of you on this. I know, right? There are important distinctions between the First Amendment and cultural issues of free speech, and where we disagree is, I think perhaps the tools or what the companies do, the amplification or suppression is expressive in and of itself, and that raises the same concerns. But there's a vast distinction between what the government may tell platforms to do, but it's also okay for us to say, this is what I think the platforms should or should not do. That is a legitimate topic of discourse. And so there's two separate components. There is, what should the government be allowed to mandate or forbid? And what do we think the best practices of the platforms should do? Whether you're coming from the perspective of how do we maximize users' free speech on a platform, or how do we think as customers effectively of platforms they should alleviate some harms. But I do also want to tie it back to Vice President Vance's comments on AI, because it's important. He's entirely right that AI is properly viewed in large part through a free speech lens for two reasons. First of all, much like the internet generally, AI is a huge step forward in democratizing speech. It allows more people to create more speech more effectively and more cheaply. And just if you take, for example, elections, you can, with AI, do what would normally take an entire room full of staffers and a boatload of money to do very cheaply. That has an impact to increase our options at the ballot box. You have the ability to challenge incumbent powerful interests with much easier and cheaper communications. There are, of course, downsides that we'll probably talk about at some point. But in addition, AI is a huge step forward in knowledge generation. It is a way that we actually generate knowledge. And we have to be very skeptical of the tendency of big, powerful interests, whether they're industry or elites or government, to wrest control of that and then perhaps tilt how knowledge is generated for all of us in the future. So that's it. Vice President Vance was very on the money, I would say, when he, in his remarks this morning.
Yeah, so I think it's not a coincidence that Vance was making this in Europe. I think there's a message from the current administration to especially the European Union, which has traveled around the world with the message that the DSA, for instance, is sort of the global gold standard for tech regulation, and where I think it's a very sweeping piece of legislation, which, from a U.S. perspective, veers too far towards government regulation of speech, but also obviously has geopolitical implications, because if Europe is the one setting the rules for, where do you draw the line on online speech around the world, that's a huge outsized impact. And I think there's also sort of a bit of a maybe a vibe shift in the U.S. saying, okay, well, you've created all these rules, but where are your companies? And show us what you got. So I think, and I personally think that it's a good thing that there's a pushback against too aggressive European legislation. Where I maybe am a bit more skeptical is about how principled the administration will be on free speech of its own critics, and that's maybe something that we can revisit, because it might like to sort of push back against the Europeans, push back against big tech for censoring voices that they don't like. But I think there are quite a few signs that maybe it's also willing to sort of go after people that are critical of the administration.
Sounds like a strong case for applying common carriage obligations on the platforms.
Boo.
I'm just trying to rile you up. That's all.
I'm not going to take the bait.
I want to go back to a point that Yael made about this distinction between what constitutes online free speech and how companies are responding to that. I mean, obviously, we've seen plenty of content moderation changes at X, formerly Twitter. More recently, Meta has made new announcements around this, loosening content moderation policies, independent fact-checking, moving towards this community-based model. But there's been lots of embrace of this in the narrative of pushing for more free speech. But we've also seen strong reactions against it, and we've also seen lots of hateful content, extreme views rise. So this blends itself into the content moderator's dilemma. How should companies be approaching this today?
I don't think there's one size fits all for how companies should navigate that. I think there are at least two ways you can look at the meta changes. One is to be very, very cynical and say, well, this was all just designed to curry favor with the new administration, and ultimately the company doesn't really care. That's one issue. The other is to take seriously what Zuckerberg said, that there's been a movement towards increasingly focus on harm and safety, and less on sort of the originally animating Silicon Valley ideas of free speech on these platforms. And I think, at least in the work that we have done, especially looking at Europe, we see that the tendency has been that. So we looked, for instance, at Germany, Sweden, and France. And we looked at the deleted comments on YouTube and Facebook, and something like 95% of the deleted comments were perfectly legal. Some of them were not even controversial. So that speaks to this concern about over removal on platforms. The danger is, of course, that if this is just a cynical ploy, then will Meta just say, okay, we're now going to remove less speech that we did before, because it will piss off, because it used to piss off the conservatives. And instead, we're going to take subtle little hints from the new administration and its allies, and then remove other types of speech. Then, we're no better off. Then it sort of weaponizes content moderation. So what Meta has to do on its platform is try to come up with something that is coherent. You can never get to, I think, perfect speech regulation, but elucidate principles that are easier. And ultimately, I think the better solution is to empower users to have more control over what type of content they're confronted with, which is also one of the reasons why I actually think it's a good idea to move towards a crowdsourced fact-checking, which I think is a step forward, which I think is supported by lots of good research. That is a model which may not be perfect now, but which is something that is scalable. I think one country which has really showed the way is Taiwan. Like, Taiwan is a country that is facing the most organized campaign of state-sponsored disinformation from mainland China, but it has built a very resilient system. It has rejected a DSA-style legislation. It relies to a very large extent on a civic tech sphere of NGOs that do real-time crowdsourced fact-checking and it works. It's a very resilient democracy. They have lower levels of polarization than in this country. So I think that is a digital democracy that has created an operating system, if you like, for the digital age, which we can learn a lot from, and which basically uses access to information and free speech as a comparative advantage against a totalitarian state, which sees free speech and access to information as the most direct threat to its form of governance.
Doesn't this kind of? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say, so while in theory, I agree with the idea that you don't want platforms, whether it's over moderating or making decisions. I never wanted Mark Zuckerberg to be the arbiter of truth. Like, that has never been something I wanted. But in reality, when Mark Zuckerberg makes the announcements, couching it as because I'm a champion of free speech, while at the very same time making line edits in the hate speech, now hateful conduct policies that he doesn't announce publicly, that are very, like, I want to be in the weeds on this for a second. It's one thing to say we are no longer going to moderate hate speech in a messed up way, I would have almost respected that more. Instead, in the weeds, it's you can call a trans person mentally ill. Like, that's very specific. To go that into the weeds of changing hate speech policies that very much seem to align with a certain movement right now is really concerning. And then to say, well, let's put it on the users, yes, I agree in more user control, all of that. But nothing that we've talked about is where does responsibility lie with these companies? Like, there cannot, let's be very clear. This is still the only industry that gets to study itself and gets to tell us what they've taken down, what they've left up, how things are being recommended. I mean, as much as we all might research these platforms, none of us, if we are independent researchers or civil society orgs, truly have insight into what's happening because of the lack of change. I see you gunning. Let me just finish really quickly. And so part of why I don't love when everything that happens online is couched into one conversation about free speech is that is a bit misleading. I will give an example. To your point, though, by the way, I do believe that every platform has the right to make their own rules. But are they living up to the rules, which is the contract that they're making with you when I decide to join one platform versus another? If I decide that I want to go join a very left-leaning platform versus a very right-leaning platform, I am agreeing to this is what this platform is. It's when you're joining one of these platforms that claims to have policies and then they don't enforce them, and then there's no way to actually study that, and there's no way to actually hold them accountable for that. I'd say, one, that's one of the big problems. But two, also when some of these companies, especially some of the bigger ones, are contributing to even illegal activity. I'm going to give you one example. After the CEO of Telegram got arrested, as some of you might remember, our team at Cybersecurity for Democracy did a search, a very simple search for Telegram-linked ads on Meta platforms. And we did a search. This is something that my team has particular expertise in. And it was so easy to find all these Telegram ads that violated every one of the platform's policies and had scams, potential CSAM, illegal activity in the ad itself. And we proposed the most easy solution. It's a very easy technical solution. If you know that Telegram ads have a higher tendency to actually, and by the way, remember, these are things that the company itself is profiting from. This is not just free speech. They are profiting from it and selling targeting tools to these advertisers. All you have to do is, this is a high signal. Telegram-linked ads happen to be a high signal. You could add an extra level of scrutiny. And why do I bring up this example? Because today, you could go and look at Telegram-linked ads on Facebook, and it would still show you a bunch of really illegal stuff. And my point in that is, how is that a free speech debate as opposed to a company responsibility debate?
So
yeah,
I actually was excited because we found another area of agreement here.
I mean, you came going with the fact that we wouldn't agree.
I know. I was surprised as anyone.
All right, I really would like to get the panel's view on this too, and especially yours. So doesn't this kind of give up the ghost on their whole speech argument entirely? I mean, frankly, and I think that was the one thing that was the most damning to me about this sudden switch. I mean, you saw it especially with, even in the TikTok case. Like one day, TikTok is nothing.
Hold on, Joel. I'm going to go back to what you said.
Don't worry. We have at least 33 minutes. So we saw this with the TikTok case. We saw it first when TikTok thought it was advantageous for them to side with more Democrat-leaning folks. They pushed a lot of things that I would expect Democrats would agree to. But the moment they thought that Democrats weren't on their side, all of a sudden Charlie Kirk gets more play. All of a sudden conservatives get more play. So this goes back to a very essential question that I have, and I think Yael raises very well. what is their speech exactly? I hearken back to Clarence Thomas on this. Please tell me, like, what speech interests they have other than to collect data and keep you on their platforms. Like that's fundamentally not been the way we viewed the First Amendment, the way we viewed government restrictions. I mean, if that's the case, then we're in a pretty tough spot to rein in any aspects of their business models. And I just think that's a very sad America.
So to go back to what Yael said, first of all, I think I agree with you that we actually should be extremely skeptical of when CEOs will say this is about free speech for exactly the reason that you identified. There is no, from a free speech perspective, philosophically, there is no reason why one should be able to call a trans person mentally ill, but say not call somebody mentally ill on the basis of religion or whatever. From a free speech perspective, those things are not any different. And if you think that platforms having, their content moderation rules is censorship, and you are worried about platforms controlling what is or isn't acceptable, this is a tech CEO determining for everyone what ideas and what discourse is mainstream enough, or enough people are saying it that it is now acceptable. It's the same problem, just at a higher level. So I'm deeply skeptical of this as well. But I also think, while I understand the transparency argument, and it's sympathetic in a way. However, when you get to whether platforms are actually living up, say, to their content moderation standards, that puts the government, including the courts, in the position of having to second-guess platforms' editorial decisions and
I disagree.
and substitute for the platform's judgment their own. And so, for example, the government can't prohibit hate speech.
I didn't say based on content. There are content-neutral ways of doing this. I wholeheartedly
but
disagree.
not when it comes to subjective content-based rules. If the government can't,
no
Wait,
line
let's
there.
let him
if
finish
the
his
government
point
can't
without interrupting.
pass a hate speech law, why can the government tell a platform, well, that's actually hate speech and you didn't remove it, and therefore, you are liable for whatever not being consistent?
To be clear, that's not what I said.
Oh no, I'm
just wanna make sure, 'cause
raising a
that's-
caution about the idea.
And also, but still, Ari, I don't see. I think the picture you're framing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these platforms are in some ways like newspapers, and essentially create that they have this editorial discretion that I think is still very ill-defined, even in the net choice decisions. And the question, really, you guys have a tough row to hoe here, because you basically have to demonstrate that contracting in and of itself is some form of expression, because that is all this is at the end of the day. It is. It's 100% a contract. That's what a terms of service is. That's what a privacy policy is.
But again,
and so you're saying that we can't even look at that because they have some ephemeral, amorphous.
But you can't have a court saying this is how you should view this speech. That is, you can't tell the court this is how you should categorize
I'm not
this speech as
saying that.
hateful.
Neither of us said that.
No.
That's where you're misrepresenting our argument.
So how do you say, is a platform applying its hate speech policy in accordance to how it says it will?
You do know there's a
without
Section
looking-
5 of the FTC Act that prevents you from making false claims.
which is not applicable, which doesn't have power over editorial decisions.
I do
FTC
want to say
The
our
FTC Act isn't
my
talisman against
example
the
was
First
about
Amendment.
illegal activity. It was not about how a company moderates hate speech, first and foremost.
I'm going to-
Secondly, you know what?
No. I'm enjoying
Okay, I
He's
can-
enjoying the show.
I'm enjoying the.
I can
infighting here.
jump in here. Appreciate the debate.
I like to
When
think
we
of it as
ta-
more a heated discussion.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Here I
When we
started off
think
with areas
about-
of agreement.
When we think about things like transparency, accountability, how can that be implemented from the company standpoint, and then as well as from policymakers?
Well, hold them to their word. I mean, at the end of the day, they're the ones who are setting the terms of service. I think we all agree on that, right? No one here is saying that they aren't setting their own terms. The question is, how do they apply those contractual terms? And to say that, simply by them putting out terms of service and then selectively deciding when to apply those terms is somehow an equitable result, I think is a bizarre argument. And I think also to say that even when they selectively decide what they want to enforce is somehow a speech issue is a gross misrepresentation of how we viewed speech. I mean, even if you look at the TikTok case, hold on. Even when you look at the TikTok case, they categorically reviewed that specific question with respect to whether or not an algorithm or the regulation of an algorithm is inherently speech, and they rejected it. They said that that's absolutely not true. They said ultimately, if you want to look at,
You're overstating the whole thing.
Well, no, I'm actually not, because like that, it said outright that as long as it's based off of if it could stand on content neutral grounds, then it can move forward. However, you are correct. If there is if at the end of the day the regulation says we want to regulate the algorithm to only have X inputs over Y inputs, I agree with you. At that point, okay, that regulation of an algorithm, but what you're saying is categorically you can't touch the algorithm, which again the court reviewed, laughed it out of court, and said,
I don't know if I said
come
that.
back again later when you have a real First Amendment, or when you have a real speech implication. But again, I want to reiterate here, I haven't heard one credible speech interest that you allege outside of again this amorphous, very wishy-washy view of content.
It's not amorphous.
moderation.
They're publishing speech. That is quintessential First Amendment territory. It couldn't be less amorphous.
You said publishing. We're talking about the actual distribution mechanisms, but also, I mean, I get that we want to have this fight. I'm personally
And I'm
here.
sorry,
No.
but
I'd
I mean-
rather just share knowledge. And so, my point here. You asked a question about transparency
And accountability.
and accountability. So starting with transparency, at the end of the day, we are a democracy, and part of being a democracy is having the right to understand how companies affect our health, how companies affect our lives. And so the transparency conversation, the interesting thing here, it's not transparency just for transparency's sake. A lot of these debates remain debates because at the end of the day, we don't have true factual knowledge of what is really happening inside some of these companies. And for those of you who don't realize, I worked at Meta when it was still Facebook for a short while. I can guarantee you that most of us do not have any idea what decisions are being made, how the algorithms are being tuned, what is being prioritized. And so one of the most important things here is there has been a coordinated attack over the last few years against researchers and against civil society orgs who are exercising their own First Amendment rights to study these platforms, to put out what they believe is happening. And there's been a coordinated assault against that, whether it is from court cases that are trying to lump civil society and researchers into the same category as government when it's about studying platforms, or whether it is the owner of a social media platform trying to sue every civil society org that does anything to try to expose what's happening on their platform out of existence for exercising their own free speech, or whether it is drowning researchers in subpoenas and frivolous lawsuits, or making sure that the API is no longer free or accessible, and that it is either cost prohibitive or gone altogether with Meta killing CrowdTangle. This is something we should all be concerned about, whether we sit on your side or my side. We as the public have a right to know how private companies are affecting our lives, and right now we do not have true insight. So this right to research, this right to be able to understand how they affect our lives is what transparency is about.
As a normative matter, I 100% agree that they should be allowing this, to be clear.
Yeah, and
let's end the
I
debate
also
there.
completely agree that Elon Musk suing civil society organizations, whether you think their research is good or bad, that is a clear attempt to sort of stifle transparency. But I think the DSA is a good example of what transparency, for instance, where you have this rather nebulous concept of systemic risk, where the commission actually acts as a regulator, but no one really knows what systemic risk means, and that's where you have this, at least risk that you have the thumbs of the scale of a regulator, which is the commission, into saying, well, it might be that disinformation is not per se illegal content, but it creates a systemic risk, and therefore you have to do certain mitigating measures, and that can skew speech in a particular way that could be speech restrictive. So transparency should optimally be to provide civil society better understanding of the platforms, and then allow them to make an informed choice, and then you would hope to have an ecosystem of social media where you actually have meaningful choice, both among different platforms, but maybe also on the platforms itself. So you could have ways to, as I said, have a larger degree of control of what kind of content you want. Maybe you don't want to be confronted with anything political. Maybe you only want maybe you're only interested in knitting. Maybe you want to be part of an Cohn debating society where that is very vigorous and where epithets are allowed. But that choice, I think, is at the core. And I think that gets us to a healthier place than government regulation.
And look, I'm going to end on what we all agree here. I think that what we're really talking about here is whether or not you can trust the moderator, and whether the moderator is someone to be trusted. And I think that's where ultimately what we're all getting to here is, okay, so let's say I accept that they have at least some semblance of editorial discretion. Just tell us what it is, and so also tell us how we as consumers can evaluate our rights even under the rights that you gave us. So this is where I think there's a lot of disagreement. I also think this is why there's a lot of consternation in a lot of these speech cases that you're seeing around the courts, where they it's a lot of the things that the platforms have been saying is kind of at this point. It borders on parody, that where they make the argument on the one end that, look, this is our editorial discretion, and we have these speech interests, and we're really just trying to get a message out there. And then in a separate legal proceeding, they argue in Section 230 that they don't have any speech interests, and in fact they need to be passive platforms.
That's not the argument.
But hold on, that's actually what the Third Circuit said. So that. So I think there is a middle ground here, and you might agree with it, you might not. I expect you won't, but. I think really what it comes down to, I think there is an interesting proposal here where we're starting to evaluate the doublespeak, and we're trying to figure out exactly what these platforms mean. Do they mean what they say? And ultimately, I think we got some good case rulings in the Third Circuit where they said, look, it's a choice. You can't have it both ways. You can't simply use statutory immunities that are dedicated to ensure that everyone has a right to say what they want on your platform and not get in trouble for it, while at the same time you can't say that in and of itself is your speech. At that point, this is where we get into loggerheads, and I think if we just came to the table on this, we might actually make some inroads on quelling some of the concerns, and definitely the government overreach. But I can see you.
That's not the Third Circuit got that wrong, because you actually can have it both ways. Congress couldn't pass a law and say Ari Cohn is not liable for any of his speech, and therefore he has no First Amendment interest in any of his speech. Section 230 doesn't mean that a social media platform isn't a speaker. It says it shall not be treated as a speaker for liability purposes. Those are two very different things. That's a choice by Congress.
You're being a little too clever by half on that.
No, it's not. It's actually the law.
So there are two different immunities. You know you're playing both sides. There's a C1.
No, there's no doublespeak there. The First Amendment.
May I pick up on the accountability part?
Let's let Yael speak.
Thank you. So yes, I agree with the doublespeak thing, right? They want all the protections of the First Amendment as a speaker, and then all of the protections under 230, and they want it both ways. But I just want to give a concrete thought experiment here, right? So, because you keep bringing it back to purely speech, and I keep trying to bring it back to something that actually talks about what would be a legal activity. So if you think about accountability, so if you see that somebody online is engaging in things you disagree with, even if I'm going to go to like extreme examples. You see somebody engaging in what some would consider overly explicit sexual activity online that you have an issue with. Should the company be responsible for that? Or should the person who's engaging in that activity be responsible for that? One could argue that the individual should be. Now, if you find out that the same company also is boosting and amplifying that because it's engaging, would you think that it's still the individual or the company? And this is where a lot of people are going to debate. What if the next step is you find out that the company took that individual who is a full-blown adult and sent him recommendations for teenagers and saying, you might want to connect with this person, and that person's a 14-year-old girl. And they send a recommendation to that 14-year-old girl saying, you might want to connect with this person. And the company itself recommends they connect, and it turns out that person's a predator, and that person ends up grooming them. Do you believe at least that if that girl ends up being a victim, she should at the very least have her day in court to be able to at least challenge that company? And it doesn't mean I'm saying if the company is guilty or innocent. I'm saying should she at least have her day in court? And I will tell you right now, she will not.
Yep.
Because the company will claim that they are preemptively immune because they will claim that was all about speech. And this is where we're trying to unpack the difference between speech and the tools that the companies themselves are employing. And all I am saying is that young girl would deserve her day in court, and it would be on the company to prove that they are innocent. But we don't even make it to that phase at this point because of the preemptive immunity that they are afforded.
I agree with. I think that's a sympathetic argument. I really do. On the other hand, I think also it's easy to make those kinds of policy preferences based on the worst case scenario. And if we could limit it to maybe perhaps that, you'd probably get a lot of
But that's what laws and courts are for, and we're not even getting. I brought up an extreme case for a reason. These cases exist.
But think of all the non-extreme cases where the lawfare gets waged and it's 1,000,001 different things trying to
That's what the law is here for. The law is here to differentiate between that.
Okay.
Like you literally just cited a precedent. That's what it's for.
Right. So I'm hearing that there is some agreement over the fact that there should be some level, some degree of transparency and accountability from these platforms. The route of which one takes to get there is where there's disagreement. I mean, when you think of oversight, there are levers, but is this a matter of just, having these executives come before Congress and testify over and over again? Or is there some sort of maybe targeted regulatory pathways that you see are possible?
I really do think it comes down to articulating the harm. I think we can all agree on that. I mean, when it comes to any form of legislation or anything, and this is exactly I think what you was getting at, is that you have to articulate what you are trying to legislate. And I didn't mean for that to rhyme, but I'm proud of myself. But at the end of the day, I do think that this back and forth, and I keep using the phrase doublespeak, but I'm going to say it outright lying about what they do and how they do it is becoming not just untenable, but unacceptable. And I think at this point we have to come to the realization that at some point the corporate speech that we all have come to know in the digital age is a bit misguided for several different reasons. One is that you can't address the things that you're saying, because even if you would try to legislate that, and I know this isn't the point, you weren't exactly trying to make this point, but you get those arguments where, oh, but what about this? Those are just extreme cases that really don't happen. And then you use an argument like, well, here are these other extreme cases that never happen that's going to get swept in. And then we're just talking past each other instead of actually trying to solve a problem. You see this with respect to kids online and all the legislation going on there. I mean, think about the fact that we think that corporations have a speech interest in forwarding predators to them, and the fact that we can't do anything with respect to reining that in, or at the very least addressing it through legislation, because some court may down the road feel like that might implicate one person's speech interest, and that one person happens to be a multi-trillion-dollar corporation, is a crazy world to live in. I mean, at some point we have to take back the First Amendment and say the First Amendment was a bulwark for us. It's a shield for us, not a sword for big tech to use to slice down any meaningful legislation. And if we can't even get to that point, like, we're lost at sea, guys.
But that's if the First Amendment doesn't protect the people or the companies you don't like, it doesn't protect anyone.
It doesn't do that.
And the thing is, in the case of, say, predation and illegal activity, there actually is some remedy. If you can prove that the company did it knowingly, there is absolutely
You can't
criminal
prove that
liability.
if it gets thrown out based on Section 230
Exactly.
preemptive immunity.
Well, not always under Sesta Fosta.
Can I say one thing? So there's, this is a very U.S.-focused debate. I think it's critically important also to look at the global ramifications. Right now, we're living through what I would call a free speech recession around the world, where free speech is under attack. And what we see in all countries is that the online space is where people want to, where rulers want to clamp down. And so I am very sympathetic to some of the things that you said, some of those harms. But I think we also have a tendency, especially in mature open democracies, to take all the benefits of free speech and access to information for granted and focus very much on the harms, and then sort of being willing to legislate on the basis of harm. This is, of course, even more prevalent outside the U.S. I mentioned the DSA, but I would say, and the TikTok case is something that worries me a lot. I would say, France had banned TikTok in New Caledonia for 2 weeks. But apart from that, you have to go to India, which is no longer, I would say, a free and open democracy. Otherwise, and then you have Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan. And so the US, which has been the driver of internet freedom for a very long time, suddenly comes out, and Joel is probably going to protest vigorously, but essentially bans TikTok, which I think sends a very disturbing message and will create lots of pathways for other countries to essentially shut down other platforms, many of them Americans. And I also don't think that, so my kids, I moved here a couple of years ago with my kids. The reason why they seamlessly were able to go to high school, for instance, is because they use U.S. tech platforms to learn to speak the language. So there's a lot of, I think, cultural power, soft power that the U.S. gets from the ability to share ideas, and very much also share ideas that would not be open to people living in countries with official propaganda and censorship dominating. How do Iranian women sort of burning their hijabs, how do they get publicity? Well, they do that by being able to use VPN maybe to get it on Instagram, or send messages to people who can then share it in the West. So that's why I think we have to be very focused, and that's why I tend to lean more towards Ari, and sort of saying, yes, there are very compelling cases to be made for some of the harms, but the tricky part about free speech is that there are always really strong arguments for restricting it, but they tend to erode that bulwark that you mentioned. I mean, and I don't want to make a parallel here between Russia and the United States, but what was the reason? What was the thing that really got Putin control over the Russian internet? That was protection of children. That really systematized it. So I think you have to be careful about having a too harm-based.
So I don't think we disagree as much as you think we do.
I don't think.
Well, he implicated the TikTok case. So I just want to say one thing
Very
about
quickly, please.
All right. So look, and I'm not going to be vigorous. I'll be more emphatic. I promise. So my. First, there's nothing in the TikTok case that actually, and that actually implicates the TikTok speech outright. Like, frankly, it was a there was a divestiture requirement. All they had to do is divest, and they can preach whatever they wanted to preach. All the stuff that you're talking about could have still gone through. There's nothing in there like applying foreign ownership restrictions and protecting American data from a foreign adversary like China. I think is ultimately a good thing and actually very pro free speech. And with that, I'll yield.
I'm going to stop it there. Jakob, I want to go to an earlier point you mentioned about empowering the users, and we have some time left for audience questions, so be thinking about that in a second. With that, we've seen the rise of more decentralized social networks like Mastodon, Blue Sky. I mean, is this a trend that you see going to continue, where folks are kind of departing the traditional social media platforms and looking for new avenues where they feel more empowered?
Whether they will depart completely or whether they will just have more options, I think it'll probably be a mix of those, and I see that as a good and healthy thing. I think my experience in Blue Sky now is that it's still sort of very anti-X. So I think there's. I like the protocol. I like the idea behind it a lot. I think it's a positive step. I think there's probably still some way to go to make it sort of more diverse, where you have actual debates between people who disagree, even politely. But I think it's a very positive step, and I think there's a lot of people working in that space. You even have like more radical things like Noster, if you want to go completely censorship resistant. So lots of these things going on. I think that's a positive development. I think it's impossible to know where we end up, but that sense of giving a higher degree of empowerment to users, I think, is absolutely essential, and goes back to the core of free speech, right? We don't want, even if you sort of say that the First Amendment applies only to the government, you don't want huge gatekeepers to be able to influence. And then Joel says, "Well,
I'm so happy you said that." Yeah, thank you.
But you also don't want the government to go in and say, "Hey, we have this problem with gatekeepers. We have these laws that will remedy this, and we'll be in charge of enforcing them and interpreting them."
Well, I was going to say that I think I agree in a large part, and then a little bit on the edges, I think we disagree. I don't think you actually would disagree with this. I think the migration in and of itself will depend a lot on this gatekeeping effect, but also antitrust enforcement. So I think the two things go hand in hand. So in order for, you're seeing this in the Google case too, with respect to scalability and all these other, and the ability for users to effectively use some of the larger platforms scale, or even be able to scale, I think will come down at least in some part. In how strong of enforcement we'll have on the antitrust and competition side. That was the only thing I was going to add. But I mean, overall, I think we are in agreement on that.
Okay, we're going to open it up to. We have a few minutes for any audience questions.
Hi, go Birds. Real quick question. I'm glad you guys brought up Blue Sky and alternative tech platforms. Do you think in the future intermediaries like Cloudflare and the app stores and stuff will be more or less likely to shut them down as they did in 2018 or in the debanking situations that we had after January 6th, 2021, where a lot of these companies used their power to shut down certain apps. So Truth and others kind of popped up. But Parler, for example, was shut down. And I think Cloudflare, the CEO of Cloudflare said that he woke up one day and just said, I want to get rid of these guys. Is that more or less likely to happen among intermediaries going forward or not?
100%.
But Cloudflare, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't that over the Kiwi Farms situation?
No.
No? Am I mixing up
No,
my...
that was it was over not using photo DNA, I think.
Okay, sorry.
It was
mixing up my platforms.
over January.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, you're right about that.
I think what our good friend, I think he said his name was Gilbert, which is a code for Nathan Lemur.
Said go Birds.
So I think he gets at a good point, and I think this is something that even the FCC chair pointed out, which was, there is a single choking point of these internet ecosystems, and a lot of it leans back to platforms like Apple and Google. And so I think, being able to being able to migrate in the way that you suggest, I think also has to be there has to be some allowance in some type of competition regulation or at least enforcement. And so I think issues like Parler really do raise those competition concerns. So I mean, my instinct is like right now they feel no pressure, or there's really, I know this is called the moderator's dilemma. I don't think they feel a dilemma what's one iota. So but until we address the competition concerns, I really don't think we're going to see mass migrations from one platform to another platform, no matter how much you like free speech or they say they do. Next.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we've had some good analogies and examples. I wanted to offer up one for the panel, especially since Joel and Ari, you've been doing a good job keeping us very well entertained. I appreciate it. I was formerly on the content policy team at Meta. I was on a team that was responsible for writing the community standards. And so to say that what I was doing was not engaging in a substantive debate with many of my colleagues about what should and should not be on the platform, I often lost those debates. I felt like I was, wanted more expression, but I often lost those battles, but it was a very rigorous discussion and debate that seemed very akin to what a newsroom would go through in an op-ed discussion, or what decision, maybe the example I want to reach for is, how is that so different than a bookstore deciding which kind of book it wants to platform? We were deciding, say, we want this, we don't want this, and was it done perfectly? No, by no stretch of the imagination was it perfect, but I imagine booksellers often miss, oh, I shouldn't have included that book, that broke my standards of what I want to include. So I guess the question is how is what I was doing not speech? It seemed very rigorous discussion over what speech to platform and distribute.
So I want to go back to a few things in response to this. Again, a private company deciding, as long as it's not breaking the law, what it does or does not want to allow on its platform is not what we should be debating here. I think we are broadly using the term censorship to over-apply to things. Censorship is when the government tells you what you can and cannot say. Censorship is not if Meta decides whether you agree with it or not to enforce its rule against an individual for engaging in something that violates its policies. That is not censorship. That is a private company's decision. And so to your point, I don't know that I would call that, I don't know that that's a question of speech. That's a question of Meta deciding and debating what their policies are going to be. And I think the trickier part is, do they then enforce those policies? But that is, I want to bring it back to something I said at the beginning. I think we are very casually mixing up free speech, free expression, and what the company's own tools and responsibilities like. Because if we put everything under the umbrella of free speech, then we will never be able to in any way figure out what accountability for anything looks like, because this will be the only industry that is above the law in every way whatsoever, while becoming the richest companies in the world. Like, just wrap your head around that. You're right. Like, I do think some of the internal debate, even when I was there at Meta, was rigorous and was very interesting. But once you make that decision and you put that out in the world,
own it.
But also, is anybody even able to study it to make sure that that's actually what's happening? But I just want to make sure that, at least for my final word, I am separating what is speech versus what is actual legal activity and what is companies' own things that they're like their own tools versus expression. And we have muddied all of that in some of the conversation.
That's what we're supposed to do, right?
I think, so I think maybe where we are, disagreeing futilely is, I think if you want to talk about just like totally, definitely illegal stuff, I think that's an entirely separate conversation. I think it's one worth having. I will also, I think that the distinction between speech and a company's own tools as a general matter is a false dichotomy. I think that a company's tools can be used for expressive purposes in a way
They can be, but
right.
not
Okay,
absolutely 100% with no pushback ideas, laws, or research into it.
All right, we're at time, so thank you all for being here, and I appreciate it. Give a warm round of applause, please, for our